The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana wilderness as Jake Martinez adjusted his worn leather gloves and checked his gear one final time. At 28, he had been working as a horse wrangler for the Double Creek Ranch for over 6 years, and he thought he had seen everything the rugged terrain could throw at him. The familiar weight of his hunting knife on his belt provided comfort as he prepared for what should have been a routine cattle roundup in the remote northern pastures. Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old environmental biology graduate student from the University of Colorado, had arrived at the ranch 3 days earlier to conduct research on local wildlife migration patterns. Her professor had arranged for her to stay at the ranch while she collected data for her thesis on how climate change affected animal behavior in mountainous regions. Jake had been assigned to guide her to the research sites, ensuring her safety while she worked in the wilderness. The ranch foreman, Bill Henderson, had given them clear instructions that morning. They were to check the cattle in Sector 7, a remote grazing area about 12 miles northeast of the main ranch buildings. The area was known for its challenging terrain, with steep ravines and thick forest that made navigation difficult even for experienced riders. Sarah needed to set up motion sensor cameras along the wildlife corridors that ran through the same region. As they saddled their horses in the pre-dawn darkness, Jake noticed Sarah seemed nervous. She had mentioned during dinner the previous evening that she had been having strange dreams since arriving at the ranch. Local wildlife had been acting unusually aggressive, and several ranchers in the area had reported livestock going missing under mysterious circumstances. The regional wildlife department had dismissed these reports as typical predation by mountain lions or bears. But the ranchers knew something felt different. Jake's horse, Thunder, a reliable quarter horse he had worked with for 4 years, seemed skittish as they loaded the pack animals with Sarah's research equipment and supplies for the day-long expedition. The other horses were equally restless, their ears constantly swiveling and their nostrils flaring as if detecting scents that humans couldn't perceive. Even the ranch dogs, usually eager to accompany the riders, seemed reluctant to venture beyond the safety of the barn area. The ride to Sector 7 took them through increasingly dense forest and up steep mountain trails that tested both horses and riders. Sarah proved to be a capable horsewoman despite her academic background, handling her mount with confidence as they navigated rocky switchbacks and crossed several swift-moving streams, swollen by recent mountain snowmelt. Jake found himself impressed by her determination and focus, though he noticed she kept glancing nervously at the tree line. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a thick mist began to roll in from the western peaks. The familiar sounds of the forest seemed muted and strange. Birds that should have been active in the morning hours were silent, and the usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush was absent. Jake's years of experience in these mountains told him that something was disturbing the natural balance of the ecosystem. When they finally reached Sector 7 around midday, they found the cattle clustered together in an unusual defensive formation near the center of the pasture, far from their normal grazing areas along the creek. The animals appeared stressed, constantly looking toward the northern tree line and stamping their hooves nervously. Jake had never seen cattle behave this way without an obvious threat present, and his unease began to grow as he surveyed the scene. Sarah immediately began setting up her equipment, excited to document what appeared to be significant behavioral changes in the local fauna. She explained to Jake that such collective stress responses in herbivores often indicated the presence of a new predator or some other major environmental change. Her scientific curiosity overcame her earlier nervousness as she focused on her data collection, carefully positioning cameras and recording detailed observations about the cattle's behavior. As the afternoon progressed and the mist thickened, Jake noticed scratch marks on several large pine trees near the forest edge. The gouges were too high and too deep to have been made by any bear he knew, and the pattern was unlike anything he had encountered in his years working these mountains. The marks appeared fresh, with sap still oozing from the damaged bark, suggesting whatever had made them had been active very recently. The horses became increasingly difficult to manage as the day wore on, requiring constant attention to keep them from bolting back toward the ranch. Thunder, normally the steadiest horse in Jake's string, began showing signs of extreme stress, rolling his eyes and pulling against the lead rope whenever Jake tried to move him closer to the forest edge where Sarah was working. The pack animals huddled together, refusing to graze despite the abundant grass in the meadow. As evening approached and Sarah began packing up her equipment, Both she and Jake were eager to start the journey back to the ranch. The mist had grown so thick that visibility was reduced to less than 50 yards in any direction, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Jake's years of mountain experience told him they needed to get moving soon if they wanted to avoid being caught in the wilderness after dark. However, as they prepared to load the pack animals, Sarah's motion sensor cameras began detecting movement in the forest. The devices were designed to be triggered by anything larger than a rabbit, and the readings showed something substantial moving through the trees just beyond their line of sight. Sarah insisted on checking the camera feeds before they left, hoping to identify what kind of animal was causing the disturbance and the strange behavior they had observed throughout the day. Jake reluctantly agreed to give her a few more minutes, but his instincts were screaming at him to get them out of there immediately. The horses were becoming increasingly panicked, and the cattle had moved even closer together, some of them making low, distressed sounds he had never heard before. The very air seemed charged with tension, and Jake found his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the handle of his hunting knife as shadows began to lengthen in the gathering dusk. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Sarah's equipment began malfunctioning. Her expensive digital cameras, which had been working perfectly all day, started producing distorted images filled with strange static patterns and unexplained shadows. The motion sensors were triggering continuously, but when they looked in the direction of the alerts, they could see nothing through the thick mist that had settled over the mountain meadow. Jake's anxiety spiked when thunder suddenly reared up, pulling so hard on the lead rope that it nearly yanked Jake off his feet. The horse's eyes were wide with terror, showing white around the edges as he fought desperately to break free from his restraints. The other horses joined in the panic, whinnying and stamping in a chaotic dance of fear that Jake had never witnessed in all his years working with animals. Sarah, still focused on her scientific equipment, called out that she was picking up infrasound readings on her instruments. Infrasound, she explained breathlessly to Jake, consisted of sound frequencies below human hearing that many large animals used for communication over long distances. Elephants used it to coordinate their herds across miles of African savanna, and some researchers believe that unknown species might use similar methods. The readings on Sarah's devices were unlike anything in the scientific literature she had studied. The infrasound pulses were coming from multiple directions, suggesting either several large animals or one creature of enormous size moving through the forest around them. The frequency patterns were complex and seemed almost organized, as if they represented some form of sophisticated communication rather than random animal vocalizations. Jake made the decision that they needed to leave immediately. Regardless of Sarah's research interests, he began aggressively packing up her remaining equipment, while she protested that she was on the verge of documenting something potentially groundbreaking for wildlife science. The cattle had now formed a tight circle with the younger animals in the center, their heads all facing outward in a defensive formation that Jake recognized from nature documentaries about African buffalo facing lion attacks. As Jake struggled to calm the horses enough to load the pack gear, Sarah suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed toward the tree line. Through the swirling mist, they could see the tops of tall pine trees swaying and bending, as if something massive was moving through the forest. The movement was too coordinated and purposeful to be caused by wind, especially since the air in the meadow was completely still. The sound that followed made both of them freeze in terror. It started as a low rumble that they felt in their chests rather than heard with their ears, gradually rising in pitch until it became an otherworldly howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cattle responded with panicked bellowing, and several of the younger animals broke from the protective circle and ran blindly into the mist. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his hunting knife as his military training from his army days kicked in. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before returning to civilian life at the ranch, and his combat experience told him they were being stalked by something that viewed them as prey. The methodical way the sounds were surrounding them suggested intelligence and planning that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Sarah's scientific curiosity finally gave way to primal fear when her equipment registered a massive heat signature, moving through the trees less than 100 yards from their position. The thermal reading showed something roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger than any known primate, standing at least 8 feet tall with abnormally long arms and a body mass that her instruments estimated at over 400 pounds. The horses had reached a state of complete panic, and Jake realized they would never be able to mount them and ride out safely. Thunder had pulled his lead rope completely free and was galloping across the meadow toward the distant ranch, his survival instincts overriding years of training. The pack animals were rearing and fighting their restraints, with such violence that Jake feared they would injure themselves or break their valuable equipment. Making a tactical decision based on his military experience, Jake grabbed Sarah's hand and led her toward a large boulder formation near the center of the meadow. The rocks would provide some protection and give them a better view of their surroundings while they figured out their next move. Sarah clutched her most important research data to her chest as they ran, unwilling to abandon everything even in their desperate situation. From their position behind the rocks, they could see the cattle had scattered completely, with individual animals running in all directions through the mist. The sounds from the forest had grown louder and more frequent, and Jake was certain they were hearing multiple creatures communicating with each other. The tactical situation reminded him of ambushes he had faced in the mountains of Afghanistan, where enemy forces would coordinate their positions before launching an attack. Sarah's remaining functional equipment was still registering movement all around the perimeter of the meadow, but the readings were inconsistent and confusing. Sometimes the signatures appeared to be on the ground, moving through the trees, but other readings suggested something was moving through the upper canopy at heights that should have been impossible for any ground-dwelling creature to reach. The mist was growing thicker as evening approached, reducing their visibility to less than 20 feet in any direction. Jake realized they were facing a choice between trying to make their way back to the ranch on foot through unknown terrain in the dark, or finding a way to survive the night in their current location. His military training told him that movement in hostile territory during limited visibility was extremely dangerous, but staying in place while being surrounded was equally risky. As if sensing their dilemma, the sounds from the forest suddenly stopped. The silence was even more terrifying than the howling had been, because it suggested that whatever was out there was now moving into position for some kind of action. Jake checked his hunting knife and the emergency flare he carried for wilderness emergencies, knowing that his limited supplies would be little protection against whatever they were facing. Sarah whispered that her equipment was detecting rapid movement converging on their position from 3 different directions. The thermal signatures were getting closer, and she estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before whatever was stalking them would reach their hiding place behind the rocks. Jake's combat experience told him they needed to move immediately, but in the gathering darkness and thick mist, any movement could lead them directly into danger. Jake made the decision to move toward a steep ravine he remembered from their earlier reconnaissance of the area. The rocky walls would limit the directions from which they could be approached, giving them a tactical advantage despite their desperate situation. He grabbed Sarah's research pack while she gathered her most critical equipment, and together they began a careful retreat through the increasingly dense mist. The journey to the ravine became a nightmare of stumbling through unseen obstacles and trying to move quietly while their hearts pounded with terror. Every few steps, Sarah's equipment would beep softly, indicating movement in the forest around them. The readings showed that whatever was tracking them was maintaining a consistent distance, as if it was herding them toward a specific location rather than attacking immediately. When they finally reached the edge of the ravine, Jake realized his mistake. The rocky walls that he had thought would provide protection were actually a trap. The ravine was roughly 30 feet deep with steep sides that would be impossible to climb quickly, and there appeared to be only one narrow path leading down to the bottom. If they descended and were cornered, they would have no escape route. Sarah's thermal sensors suddenly went wild, detecting massive heat signatures moving rapidly through the trees on both sides of the ravine. The creatures, whatever they were, had anticipated their movement and were positioning themselves to cut off any retreat. Jake's military training told him they were facing an enemy with tactical intelligence that exceeded most human adversaries he had encountered in combat. The howling started again, but this time it was coming from directly below them in the ravine. Sarah's equipment indicated something large was moving along the bottom of the rocky canyon, traveling back and forth as if searching for the best position to intercept them. They were completely surrounded with threats above, below, and on both sides of their position. In desperation, Jake decided to use his emergency flare to try to frighten whatever was stalking them. He pulled the device from his pack and prepared to ignite it, hoping that the sudden bright light and chemical smell would drive away their pursuers long enough for them to find another escape route. Sarah warned him that the light might also attract more creatures from the surrounding area, but they had few other options. The moment Jake ignited the flare, the forest erupted in activity. The red light illuminated the mist for hundreds of yards in every direction, and what they saw made both of them gasp in terror. Massive shadowy forms were moving through the trees all around them, too large and too coordinated to be any known wildlife. The creatures appeared to be communicating with each other through a series of complex vocalizations that ranged from subsonic rumbles to high-pitched shrieks. Sarah's equipment registered at least 6 separate thermal signatures, each indicating a creature weighing several hundred pounds and standing between 7 and 9 feet in height. The beings moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were perfectly adapted to the mountainous terrain, traveling through the forest canopy and across rocky ground with equal ease. As the flare burned, casting dancing shadows through the mist, Jake caught his first clear glimpse of one of the creatures. It was standing on a rocky outcrop less than 50 yards away, silhouetted against the red glow of the emergency light. The being appeared roughly humanoid, but with proportions that were all wrong for any known primate. Its arms were exceptionally long, reaching nearly to its knees, and its shoulders were massively broad compared to its narrow waist. Most disturbing was the intelligence visible in the creature's posture and behavior. It wasn't acting like a wild animal driven by instinct, but rather like a thinking being studying its prey and planning its next move. When it noticed Jake and Sarah watching, it didn't flee or attack immediately. Instead, it stood perfectly still, regarding them with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. Sarah whispered that she was recording everything with her remaining functional equipment, understanding that they might be witnessing something that would revolutionize science if they survived to share their data. The creatures around them represented either an unknown species or something that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about primate evolution and intelligence. The flare began to fade, and as the red light dimmed, the creatures started moving closer. Jake could hear them communicating with each other through low vocalizations that sounded almost like a primitive language. The tactical coordination they displayed suggested a level of social organization that exceeded even that of advanced primates like chimpanzees or gorillas. Realizing they needed to find shelter before the flare died completely, Jake spotted a narrow cave opening in the ravine wall about 20 feet below their current position. The cave appeared to be little more than a crack in the rock, but it might provide enough protection to last through the night. Getting there would require climbing down the steep ravine wall in near darkness while being stalked by creatures that knew the terrain far better than they did. Sarah's equipment was showing that the creatures had formed a loose circle around the ravine, but they were maintaining their distance as long as the flare provided light. Jake realized they had perhaps 2 minutes before the emergency light failed completely, leaving them in total darkness with hostile beings that could apparently see and move perfectly well in conditions that would leave humans helpless. Making a desperate decision, Jake told Sarah to gather only her most essential equipment while he prepared a rope from their climbing gear. They would have to rappel down to the cave opening and hope that the narrow entrance would be too small for the creatures to follow them inside. It was an enormous risk, but staying on the rim of the ravine would leave them completely exposed once darkness fell. As Jake secured the rope around a sturdy pine tree, he could see the creatures moving closer through the fading light of the flare. Their movements were becoming more aggressive and coordinated, suggesting that the period of cautious observation was ending. Sarah managed to pack her most critical research data and equipment into a small waterproof case that she could carry during the dangerous descent. The flare finally died, plunging them into near-total darkness broken only by faint starlight filtering through the mountain mist. Jake helped Sarah into a climbing harness and prepared to lower her toward the cave opening, knowing that once they committed to this course of action, there would be no turning back. The sounds from the forest suggested the creatures were beginning to move in for what might be their final approach. The descent into the ravine became a terrifying exercise in blind faith and desperate hope. Sarah rappelled down the rocky wall first, guided only by Jake's whispered directions from above, and the faint outline of the cave opening that was barely visible in the starlight. The rope scraped against sharp rocks, and several times she had to stop and carefully navigate around obstacles that could have sent her tumbling into the darkness below. As Sarah disappeared into the cave opening, Jake heard movement on the rocks directly above him. The creatures had reached their position on the ravine rim and were investigating the rope anchor point. Through the darkness, he could hear heavy breathing and what sounded like sniffing, as if the beings were analyzing their scent trail to understand what their prey was doing. Jake began his own descent, moving as quickly as possible while trying to remain quiet. The rope burned through his gloves as he controlled his descent, and rocks loosened by his passage clattered down into the ravine below. Each sound seemed impossibly loud in the mountain silence, and he was certain the creatures above would be able to track his exact location based on the noise he was making. Halfway down to the cave, Jake felt the rope suddenly jerk upward. Something was pulling on it from above, and he realized one of the creatures had found the anchor point and was testing the rope's strength. The being seemed to understand that the rope represented a way to follow them, and Jake could hear it manipulating the climbing gear with what sounded like surprising dexterity. Fighting panic, Jake repelled the remaining distance as fast as he dared, scraping against the rocky wall and tearing his clothing on sharp outcrops. He reached the cave opening just as the rope went slack above him, suggesting that the creature had either cut it or pulled it free from its anchor. They were now trapped in the cave with no easy way to climb back out of the ravine. The cave proved to be larger than it had appeared from above, extending back into the mountain for at least 20 feet before narrowing to a passage too small for a human to crawl through. Sarah had activated a small LED flashlight from her research kit, providing just enough illumination to see their immediate surroundings without advertising their position to anything watching from outside. As they caught their breath and assessed their situation, Sarah's remaining equipment continued to register thermal signatures moving around the rim of the ravine. The creatures appeared to be testing different approaches to reach them, and several readings suggested they were attempting to climb down the rocky walls at various points. Their persistence and problem-solving abilities reinforced Jake's growing belief that they were dealing with beings of considerable intelligence. The cave walls showed evidence of previous occupation by large animals, with scratch marks in what appeared to be old bedding material made from pine branches and leaves. The markings were too large to have been made by bears or mountain lions, and their placement suggested they had been created by something that stood upright rather than moving on all fours. Sarah whispered that her equipment was detecting structural vibrations in the rock around them, as if something heavy was moving through passages inside the mountain. The cave system appeared to be more extensive than they had realized, and there might be other entrances that the creatures could use to reach them. Their refuge was beginning to feel more like a trap with each passing minute. Jake explored the narrow passage at the back of the cave and discovered that it opened into a larger chamber about 50 feet, deeper into the mountain. The chamber contained what appeared to be the remains of a primitive camp, with fire rings made from carefully arranged stones and piles of organic material that might have been food storage or bedding. The site looked ancient but showed signs of recent use. The implications of finding evidence of habitation inside the mountain were staggering. If the creatures had established permanent settlements in the cave systems, it would explain how they had remained hidden from human detection for so long. The caves would provide protection from weather and humans while giving them access to the entire mountain range through underground passages. As Jake returned to report his findings to Sarah, they heard sounds coming from the narrow entrance to their cave. Something was testing the opening, probing to determine if it was large enough to allow entry. The sounds suggested intelligence and patience rather than the blind aggression of a wild animal, as if the creature was carefully evaluating the situation before taking action. Sarah's thermal equipment indicated that at least 3 creatures had gathered outside their cave, while others continued to move through the forest above. The beings appeared to be coordinating their efforts, with some maintaining watch positions, while others explored potential access routes. Their tactical organization was becoming more sophisticated as they adapted to the challenge of reaching their cornered prey. The scratching and probing at the cave entrance continued for what felt like hours, punctuated by periods of silence that were even more nerve-wracking than the sounds of activity. During the quiet moments, Jake and Sarah could hear complex vocalizations echoing through the forest, suggesting ongoing communication between the creatures surrounding them and others that might be approaching from distant locations. Jake's military experience told him that their current position was defensible but ultimately hopeless if their pursuers had unlimited time and numbers. The creatures showed no signs of giving up or losing interest, and their apparent familiarity with the cave system suggested
They might know of other ways to reach the
chamber where Jake and Sarah had taken refuge. Sarah made the difficult decision to attempt radio contact with the ranch, despite the risk that the electronic signals might further attract the creature's attention. Her emergency radio had limited range in the mountainous terrain, but there was a chance that the ranch's communication equipment might pick up a distress signal if atmospheric conditions were favorable. As Sarah adjusted the radio settings and prepared to transmit their location and situation, Jake took up a defensive position near the cave entrance with his hunting knife ready. The blade seemed pathetically inadequate against creatures of the size and apparent strength they were facing, but it was the only weapon they had available. The sounds outside the cave suddenly stopped, creating an ominous silence that suggested the creatures were preparing for some kind of coordinated action. Sarah's equipment showed thermal signatures moving rapidly through the forest, as if the beings were repositioning themselves for a final assault on the cave. Jake gripped his knife tighter and prepared for whatever was coming, knowing that their survival might depend on the next few critical minutes. Sarah's radio crackled to life with static and broken transmissions as she desperately tried to reach the ranch. Through the interference, they could hear fragments of Bill Henderson's voice responding to their distress call, but the signal was too weak and distorted to maintain clear communication. The mountains were blocking most radio frequencies, and atmospheric conditions were making the situation worse. Between transmission attempts, they heard a new sound that made their blood run cold. Something was digging at the cave entrance, methodically removing rocks and debris to widen the opening. The creature working outside showed remarkable patience and intelligence, carefully loosening stones rather than trying to force its way through with brute strength. Jake realized they had perhaps an hour before the entrance would be large enough to allow access. The sounds of excavation were accompanied by ongoing communication between the creatures, with vocalizations that seemed to coordinate the digging effort and report on progress. Sarah's equipment indicated that more thermal signatures were approaching their location, suggesting that word of their discovery had spread throughout whatever population existed in these mountains. Jake made the critical decision to explore the deeper passages in the cave system, hoping to find either an escape route or a more defensible position. He left Sarah to continue her radio attempts while he squeezed through the narrow passage with only a small flashlight to guide him. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that showed extensive evidence of long-term habitation by the creatures. The chamber contained primitive but sophisticated arrangements that suggested complex social organization. Stone tools were carefully arranged along the walls, and what appeared to be food storage areas were positioned to take advantage of natural temperature variations in the cave. Most significantly, Jake found cave paintings that depicted human figures alongside the large humanoid creatures in what appeared to be hunting scenes. The artwork suggested that interactions between humans and these beings had occurred for possibly hundreds of years, with the creatures apparently viewing humans as both prey and competitors for territory. Some paintings showed humans being captured rather than killed, raising disturbing questions about what happened to people who disappeared in these mountains over the decades. As Jake explored further into the cave system, he discovered that the tunnels formed an extensive network that appeared to connect multiple mountain peaks. The passages showed signs of regular use with worn pathways and strategic storage points that indicated the creatures used the underground system as a highway through their territory. The caves represented a hidden civilization that existed parallel to human settlement in the region. Sarah's radio finally achieved clear contact with the ranch, and she was able to transmit their approximate location and the nature of their situation. Bill Henderson's response was immediate and decisive. He was organizing a search and rescue team with vehicles and weapons, but reaching their location would take several hours even under the best circumstances. They needed to survive until dawn when help could arrive. The digging at the cave entrance had intensified, and Jake could see that the creatures had widened the opening significantly. In the flashlight beam, he caught glimpses of massive hands with elongated fingers that showed remarkable dexterity as they manipulated rocks and tools. The beings were using primitive implements to aid their excavation, demonstrating technology used that challenged scientific understanding of primate capabilities. Sarah's thermal equipment detected movement in the deeper passages of the cave system, confirming Jake's worst fears about the extensive tunnel network. The creatures weren't just trying to dig through the main entrance. They were also approaching through the underground passages that Jake had been exploring. Their refuge was being compromised from multiple directions simultaneously. Realizing they needed to abandon their current position, Jake and Sarah gathered their essential equipment and prepared to move deeper into the cave system. The strategy was desperate and dangerous, as they would be entering territory that the creatures knew far better than they did. But staying in place was no longer an option. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a startling discovery while reviewing the data her equipment had collected throughout their ordeal. The infrasound patterns she had recorded showed evidence of sophisticated language structure, with recurring elements that suggested complex communication abilities. The creatures weren't just intelligent animals. They appeared to possess a form of primitive but organized language. Jake led the way into the deeper passages, using his military training to move quietly and efficiently through the unfamiliar terrain. The tunnels were larger than they had appeared from the main chamber, with evidence of deliberate modification to improve passage for the creature's large frames. Tool marks on the wall showed where rocks had been systematically removed to widen narrow sections. The pursuit through the underground passages became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Jake and Sarah trying to stay ahead of creatures that knew the terrain intimately. Their flashlights provided the only illumination in the absolute darkness of the cave system, but the light also advertised their location to anything following them through the tunnels. Sarah's equipment continued to track multiple thermal signatures moving through the passages around them, and it became clear that the creatures were using their knowledge of the tunnel system to attempt an encirclement. The beings were working together with tactical coordination that rivaled human military units, demonstrating intelligence and social organization that exceeded anything previously documented in primate species. As they moved through the caves, Jake began to understand the true scope of what they had stumbled into. The tunnel system wasn't just a hiding place. It was evidence of a hidden civilization that had existed in these mountains for possibly centuries. The creatures had developed their own technology, social structures, and territorial systems while remaining completely unknown to modern science. The realization that they might be the first humans to discover this hidden population was both thrilling and terrifying. If they survived to share their findings, it would revolutionize understanding of primate evolution and intelligence. However, their current situation suggested that this hidden civilization viewed humans as threats to be eliminated rather than potential allies for peaceful coexistence. The sounds of pursuit grew closer as they navigated the increasingly complex tunnel system, and Jake realized they were approaching a critical decision point. They could continue fleeing deeper into the mountains through passages that might lead nowhere, or they could try to find a way back to the surface and attempt to reach help before the creatures could organize a coordinated attack. The tunnel system led them to a vast underground chamber that took their breath away. Sarah's flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls, suggesting a space larger than most cathedral interiors. The chamber appeared to serve as a central meeting place for the creature population, with evidence of large gatherings and what looked like primitive ceremonial arrangements. Most disturbing were the collections of human artifacts scattered throughout the chamber. Backpacks, camping equipment, clothing, and personal items created a grim museum of people who had disappeared in these mountains over many years. Jake recognized some items as belonging to hikers and campers who had been reported missing, their disappearances attributed to natural hazards rather than predation by unknown creatures. Sarah's equipment detected dozens of thermal signatures moving through the chamber and connecting passages, suggesting they had stumbled into the heart of the creature's territory when the entire population was gathering. The beings appeared to be converging on their location from multiple directions, turning their exploration into a desperate flight through increasingly crowded territory. The vocalizations echoing through the chamber were unlike anything they had heard before, with complex harmonies and rhythmic patterns that suggested some form of group communication, or even primitive music. The sounds indicated excitement and agitation among the creature population, as if their presence had triggered some kind of emergency response or territorial defense behavior. Jake spotted what appeared to be a natural chimney in the chamber wall that might provide access to the surface. The opening was narrow and would require difficult climbing, but it represented their best chance of escaping the underground maze before being completely surrounded. Sarah's radio equipment might also work better closer to the surface, allowing them to provide better location information to their rescue team. As they approached the chimney opening, they heard sounds that made them freeze in terror. Heavy footsteps were approaching through the main tunnel they had used to enter the chamber, and the thermal readings suggested something much larger than the creatures they had encountered earlier. Sarah's equipment indicated a heat signature corresponding to something over 10 feet tall and weighing perhaps 800 pounds. The being that emerged into the chamber was clearly different from the others they had seen. Its massive frame and distinctive posture suggested it might be an alpha individual or leader within the creature hierarchy. The other thermal signatures in the area seemed to be maintaining respectful distances, as if waiting for direction from this dominant individual. Jake realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in primate research, a complex social structure with clear leadership roles and hierarchical organization. The alpha creature appeared to be assessing the situation and making decisions about how to respond to the human intrusion into their territory. Its behavior suggested intelligence that approached or even exceeded human cognitive abilities. Sarah managed to capture critical footage of the alpha creature with her remaining functional equipment, understanding that the scientific value of their observations could revolutionize understanding of primate evolution if they survived to share their data. The being's tool use, social organization, and apparent language abilities challenged everything scientists thought they knew about non-human intelligence. The alpha creature began vocalizing in complex patterns that were clearly directed at the other beings in the chamber. The sounds were answered by responses from multiple locations, creating what appeared to be a sophisticated conversation about how to handle the human presence. Jake's military experience told him they were listening to a tactical planning session. Realizing they had perhaps minutes before the creatures coordinated their response, Jake and Sarah began climbing the natural chimney. The ascent was treacherous, requiring them to wedge themselves between narrow rock walls while carrying essential equipment. Sarah's research data and Jake's emergency supplies made the climb even more difficult, but abandoning their gear would leave them helpless if they reached the surface. The climbing became a nightmare of physical exhaustion and psychological terror as sounds of pursuit echoed up the chimney behind them. The creatures appeared to be following, with some individuals showing remarkable climbing abilities as they navigated the narrow passage. Their superior strength and familiarity with the cave system gave them significant advantages in the underground pursuit. Halfway up the chimney, Jake's flashlight began to fail, leaving them climbing in near total darkness, guided only by the faint possibility of starlight somewhere far above. The rocks were slippery with moisture and moss, making each handhold treacherous as they struggled upward through the narrow passage. Sarah's equipment bag caught on a rocky projection, nearly pulling her from the wall as she tried to maintain her grip with increasingly tired arms. Jake managed to help free the bag while supporting both their weights against the chimney walls, but the delay allowed their pursuers to gain ground. The sounds of climbing behind them were getting closer, accompanied by heavy breathing and occasional vocalizations that suggested coordination between multiple creatures. As they neared what they hoped was the surface opening, Jake felt a draft of cool air that indicated they were approaching the outside world. The psychological relief of potentially escaping the underground maze gave them renewed energy for the final push upward, even as their muscles screamed in protest from the sustained climbing effort. The chimney opening emerged onto a rocky ledge on the side of a steep mountain slope, placing them hundreds of feet above the valley floor but still miles from the ranch. The night air felt incredibly fresh after hours in the stale atmosphere of the cave system, and Sarah immediately began trying to re-establish radio contact with their rescue team, while Jake assessed their tactical situation. From their elevated position, they could see lights moving through the forest below, suggesting that Bill Henderson and the ranch crew were already searching for them with vehicles and portable spotlights. However, the terrain between their current location and the search teams would require hours of dangerous night climbing down rocky slopes that were treacherous even in daylight. The sounds from the chimney behind them indicated that their pursuers were still climbing toward the surface, apparently unwilling to give up their hunt despite the approaching dawn. Jake realized that reaching the surface had not ended their ordeal, but simply moved it to new terrain where they would be exposed and vulnerable. While trying to reach help, Sarah's radio finally connected with the search team, and she was able to provide GPS coordinates from her research equipment that would guide the rescuers to their general location. Bill Henderson's voice came through clearly, informing them that armed ranchers were approaching their position but would need at least 2 hours to navigate the difficult terrain in darkness as the first creature emerged from the chimney opening onto the ledge. Jake found himself face to face with the nightmare that had been stalking them through the underground passages. The being was even larger and more imposing in the starlight than it had appeared in the thermal readings, with massive shoulders and arms that suggested strength far beyond any known primate. The creature paused at the chimney exit, apparently assessing this new environment and the changed tactical situation. Its behavior continued to demonstrate intelligence and caution rather than mindless aggression, as if it was weighing the risks and benefits of continuing the pursuit onto unfamiliar terrain where humans might have advantages. Jake gripped his hunting knife with determination born of desperation, knowing that the small blade represented their only defense against creatures that could easily overpower them through physical strength alone. His military training told him to look for tactical advantages in terrain and positioning, but the rocky ledge offered limited options for defense or escape. Sarah continued transmitting their situation to the rescue team while documenting everything with her remaining equipment, understanding that their observations might represent the most important scientific discovery in decades if they survived to share their findings. The creatures emerging from the cave system were proving to be far more than unknown animals. They represented a hidden civilization that had coexisted with human settlement while remaining completely undetected. The alpha creature that had dominated the underground chamber finally appeared at the chimney opening, its massive frame silhouetted against the starlit sky. The being surveyed the ledge and the humans cornered there, then began vocalizing in complex patterns that were answered by responses from the forest below. Jake realized with growing dread that the underground pursuit had been coordinated with surface teams that were now surrounding their position. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Sarah and Jake found themselves trapped on the rocky ledge with creatures above and below their position. The rescue team was still hours away, and their ammunition consisted of a single emergency flare and Jake's hunting knife. The nightmare that had begun as a routine research expedition was approaching its most critical and dangerous phase, with survival depending on decisions they would make in the next few crucial minutes. The alpha creature stepped fully onto the ledge, and for the first time Jake and Sarah could see one of the beings clearly in the growing dawn light. The creature stood nearly 9 feet tall with a muscular frame that suggested immense physical power, but its face showed intelligence and awareness that was deeply unsettling. This was not a mindless beast, but a thinking being that was studying them with obvious curiosity and calculation. Sarah found herself making eye contact with the creature, and what she saw there challenged everything she thought she knew about non-human intelligence. The being's gaze held recognition and understanding that suggested it was aware of them as individuals, rather than simply viewing them as prey or threats. The creature seemed to be assessing their behavior and responses with scientific interest that mirrored her own research methods. "Please, get me out," Sarah screamed suddenly as the full psychological impact of their situation overwhelmed her scientific training. The sound echoed across the mountain valleys, and Jake realized that her breakdown might trigger an aggressive response from creatures that had shown remarkable patience and restraint up to this point. Jake seized his hunting knife, pulling the blade from its sheath with determination born of desperation. The weapon felt pathetically inadequate against the massive creature standing before them, but it was their only defense, and he was prepared to use it. However, as he raised the knife, the nightmare in front of him rooted him to the spot with its unexpected response. Instead of attacking or showing aggression, the alpha creature stepped back and began vocalizing in what sounded like calming tones. The being's posture became less threatening, and it appeared to be trying to communicate that it had no immediate intention of harming them. The creature's behavior suggested a level of empathy and social awareness that defied everything Jake knew about predator psychology. Creatures began emerging from the chimney and appearing on rocky outcrops around the ledge, but their behavior mirrored that of the alpha individual. Rather than surrounding them for an attack, the being seemed to be forming a loose circle that felt more like curiosity than hostile intent. Sarah's equipment registered more than a dozen thermal signatures, but none were approaching aggressively. As the sun rose higher, providing better visibility, Jake and Sarah could see the full scope of what they had discovered. The creatures were clearly a distinct species with physical characteristics that placed them somewhere between modern humans and earlier hominid ancestors. Their technology, social organization, and apparent language abilities suggested they had developed their own evolutionary path parallel to human civilization. They were, radio crackled with Bill Henderson's voice reporting, that the search team had reached the base of their mountain and was beginning the climb to their position. The rancher's words carried across the morning air, and Jake noticed that the creatures responded to the human voices with obvious interest and understanding. The beings appeared to comprehend that rescue was approaching and were adjusting their behavior accordingly. The alpha creature began what appeared to be a complex negotiation with the other beings, using vocalizations and gestures that suggested sophisticated decision-making processes. Jake realized they were witnessing a primitive but functional form of democracy, as the creatures debated how to respond to the changing situation with approaching human reinforcements. Sarah, recovering from her earlier panic, began speaking in calm, measured tones toward the alpha creature. Her scientific training told her that if these beings possessed advanced intelligence, they might be capable of peaceful communication rather than conflict. She used simple words and non-threatening gestures while her equipment continued recording everything for later analysis. The creature's response was remarkable. It began mimicking some of Sarah's vocal patterns while maintaining its own complex vocalizations, suggesting an attempt at rudimentary language exchange. The being appeared to understand that Sarah was trying to communicate rather than threaten, and its posture became increasingly relaxed and curious rather than defensive. As the sounds of the approaching rescue team grew louder, the alpha creature made what appeared to be a decisive communication to the other beings. The thermal signatures began moving away from the ledge area, retreating toward the forest and cave entrances in an organized withdrawal that suggested tactical planning rather than flight. The alpha individual remained on the ledge for several more minutes, apparently studying Jake and Sarah with obvious fascination. The creature showed particular interest in Sarah's research equipment, examining the devices from a distance with the kind of curiosity that scientists show toward new phenomena. The being's behavior suggested it understood the function of the instruments and was intrigued by human technology. Bill Henderson's voice finally called out from nearby rocks as the search team reached their location. The alpha creature responded to the approaching humans by backing toward the chimney entrance, but its movements remained calm and deliberate rather than panicked. The being continued to observe the rescue operation with obvious interest in human social organization and cooperation. As armed ranchers appeared on the rocky approaches to the ledge, the alpha creature gave what sounded like a final vocalization toward Jake and Sarah before disappearing into the chimney passage. The sound carried complex emotional content that seemed to combine warning, farewell, and perhaps even respect for their survival skills and intelligence. The rescue team found Jake and Sarah exhausted, but unharmed, with Sarah clutching her research equipment and data that would soon revolutionize scientific understanding of primate evolution and intelligence. Bill Henderson and his crew expressed amazement at their survival story, but the physical evidence Sarah had collected would prove that their incredible experience had been far more than hallucination or fantasy. In the weeks following their rescue, Sarah's research data created international scientific interest and launched extensive studies of the mountain cave systems. However, subsequent expeditions found only empty chambers and abandoned sites, suggesting that the creature population had relocated to deeper or more remote areas. The beings had demonstrated not only intelligence and social organization, but also the wisdom to avoid further contact with humans who might pose threats to their hidden civilization. Jake returned to his work at the ranch with a new understanding of the wilderness he had thought he knew completely. Sarah completed her graduate studies with research that opened entirely new fields of anthropological and primatological investigation. Both carried the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, evolution, and the hidden mysteries that still existed in the modern world.